interdisciplinary research on the role of human capital in human development to inform policy solutions to global challenges that include poverty, women's empowerment, and sustainable economic growth through investments primarily in education and health. So we have 3 different initiatives, and I just want to give you a little piece of what we do in each one. One is work on population health economics, and there are 3 kind of main questions we ask here. One is about the transformation of health systems to address chronic disease epidemics. And right now, COVID-19 is one epidemic that we have a lot of path-breaking research on. A second question is about the economics of health decision-making, and right now about the economics of lockdown when it comes to COVID. And third, about structural interventions for disease prevention. A second branch of the HCI is focused on what we call POWER, the Program on Women's Empowerment Research. And this investigates the causes and consequences of women's empowerment on human well-being in both low and middle income country settings through evidence-based research. And here we're specifically considering empowerment when it comes to, on one side, human capital, so again, health and education. Secondly, considering varied mobility and access, especially in the domain of politics. Third, we really critically analyze what constitutes sustainable economic development, particularly in the context of climate change. And fourth, we look at gender equality in the labor market, which, as we know in the US and worldwide, is changing before our very eyes. And the third branch of HCI's work is in the political economy of human capital. And this focuses on human capital issues at the intersection of political economy and development, and particularly looks at how conflict, identity, and nation building are intertwined. So that's all I'll say about HCI, but please do consider subscribing to our newsletter, and please do tune in again on December 2nd for the next talk, which will be on educational reform in Mexico. And I also just want to say logistically to all of you who are attending in the audience from wherever you are, please feel free to place questions for Alisha in the Q&A box, and I will pull from there to ask her questions following her presentation. And when you do ask your question, please make sure to give your name and your institutional affiliation as well. Please note we are live streaming on YouTube, so this is indeed a public talk. And with that, I would like to just tell you a few things about Dr. Alisha Holland, who we're really honored to have here today. She's an associate professor in the government department at Harvard University, and the title of her talk today is Creative Construction: How Bureaucrats Build and Stop Infrastructure in Latin America. And just to give you a little sense of who she is in her broader intellectual world, she's an expert on the comparative political economy of development with a focus on urban politics, social policy, and Latin America. Before joining the faculty at Harvard, she was an assistant professor in the politics department at Princeton University and a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. Her first book was Forbearance as Redistribution: The Politics of Informal Welfare in Latin America, which came out with Cambridge Studies in Comparative Politics series. And this looked at the politics of enforcement against property law violations by the poor, such as squatting, street vending, and electricity theft. And I just want to tell you 2 things that people said about her book so you can get a sense of the scope of her next book, which I think is going to be the core of what she's discussing today. So in the words of Professor Ben Schneider at MIT, he described this work as one of those rare books that changes forever the way you think about an issue. In this case, the endemic and enduring informality found across the developing world. And one other faculty's words, Professor Daniel Brinks at the University of Texas at Austin noted how this book turns the tables from thinking about the agency of the wealthy to evade legal sanctions, instead to looking at how the state sometimes withholds enforcement to achieve redistributive ends. And he argues this provides the most interesting twist on the politics of social provision and the rule of law to come along in many, many years. And I'll just make a plug, even if you don't focus on Latin America, thinking about the politics of evading or withholding enforcement seems particularly relevant to the United States and elsewhere today too. And so the introduction, I'd like to end with just noting her current book project focuses on the political determinants of the level, quality, and social response to infrastructure projects in Latin America. And if you're interested, her interests also span migration, crime control, and subnational governance. We really are honored to have Professor Holland here with us today. And so the final thing I want to let you know is that we will have a dialogue after she speaks. So please do be thinking about your questions, and at any point in time, feel free to put them in the chat box, as I mentioned before. Thank you so much, Alisha, and please, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here and to learn more about the Human Capital Initiative as well. What I want to do today is share a small slice of this broader book project, which, as Rachel described, is thinking about the politics of infrastructure and especially large-scale infrastructure development. But today I really want to think more about this question of the quality of public goods that are provided, and especially infrastructure projects. And I'm going to try to share my screen now. Just get this going. So I started to think about this project actually visiting some of my relatives in Panama. And for those of you who know me, I used to be a figure skater and I loved to rollerblade. And so I was there on vacation and I asked my aunt, is there a bike path where maybe I could go rollerblading? And she immediately told me, well, you could try going on the highway. And when she said this, I first thought that she didn't really understand my question. Latin Americans are sort of notoriously skeptical of exercise, and sort of was directing me to the superhighway. But she insisted, no. The new highway, which you'll see in this picture here, the Via Costanera through Panama City, has no cars. There's no traffic. And as you can see in this photo, here's a rollerblader going peacefully along on this empty highway. And of course, when you get to the end of this highway, it is particularly interesting and notable that it finishes in a monument from the construction company that built the project, which was Odebrecht, a Brazilian construction giant that has gained notoriety for bribing most presidents in Latin America and generating an enormous international scandal. So this is a clear example where the government of Panama decided to build a project that really no one wanted. So there's very little use of this highway, and also built it at very high costs, precluding investments in many other types of public goods. So in a lot of ways, the question I want to ask is, how do we avoid these scenarios? How do we avoid white elephants? And what gets us to the scenario that governments actually are providing high quality public goods? Now, most answers in political science focuses on dynamics of electoral accountability. So politicians provide the types of public goods that citizens want and without corruption, in large part because they fear sanctions at the polls. Now, of course, there are many limitations to an electoral accountability perspective. So voters might not have information about corruption. They also might have partisan reasons not to act on that information. And of course, elections happen only every few years, giving limited opportunities to hold politicians accountable for their behavior in office. Now, another perspective, particularly when we think about dynamics around corruption and public goods provision, really focuses on institutional design and more specifically on the role of horizontal accountability institutions. So Guillermo O'Donnell turned our attention to the role of courts and prosecutors and comptrollers in providing another form of sanction to politicians. So through court cases or fines, the argument goes that bureaucracies can play a central role in ensuring that politicians avoid malfeasance and eventually deterring that malfeasance. Now, again, there are many limitations to horizontal accountability institutions. In Latin America, the general sense is that they often do too little and too late. So, for example, in the Odebrecht case I just discussed, there have been massive fines, but a country like Panama is still left with a highway project that is pretty useless for the population. And so what I want to talk about today is another element of the bureaucracy that I think is critical to this issue of how governments provide high quality public goods and how they think about the public goods that serve the public interest. So I'm going to define these as inhibitory institutions, or institutions that have the power to review or obstruct investments in public goods prior to their actual construction or implementation. And so what I want to do today is really talk mainly about the concept of inhibitory institutions and provide a little bit of theory about what they do in politics and some of the challenges that they face. Second, I'll just share a little snapshot of some of the qualitative case study evidence that I've been gathering looking at the impact of these inhibitory institutions. I'll talk about two quite different projects. One is a subway project in Bogota, Colombia, and another is the Interoceanic Highway in Peru. And these projects are really chosen to illustrate some of the extreme cases in terms of when inhibitory institutions can bind political decisions, and then also how they get subverted by politicians. And then I'll just end thinking about some of the implications for the quality of public goods provision more broadly, and then also how we think about bureaucratic capacity and the relationship between state bureaucracies and politicians. I should say this is all quite preliminary, and so I'll also share some of the more quantitative strategies I'm thinking about using for the project at the end. So let me just start with the kind of conceptual piece of this project, which is really thinking about inhibitory institutions as distinct actors, both in the control of corruption and then more broadly in the quality of public decision making. And I think there's sort of two key elements to my definition of inhibitory institutions. The first concerns when these institutional actors actually perform their roles. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of emphasis on horizontal accountability institutions, which essentially are circumscribed to acting after some malfeasance has occurred. And so a politician needs to violate a law in order for a comptroller or a prosecutor to go ahead and sanction the politician. What I'm interested in is a part of the state that actually acts before decisions are made. And so inhibitory actors are relatively unique actors within the state that are going to have powers to actually look at public decisions before they're made. And then when we think about the types of authority that these institutions have, I really divide them into three types. So first, you can think of inhibitory institutions as an example of veto players in Sabellis's formulation. So essentially actually having the power to stop a public decision. So for instance, comptrollers in Latin America historically had the power of prior control, which meant that they signed every single check that the government issued, and that no public procurement could take place before the comptroller gave that signature. So the comptroller was an incredibly powerful veto actor that's not traditionally studied. But beyond sort of veto power, inhibitory institutions often act through two potentially more subtle channels. So one of them is the power to gatekeep the actual decisions that can be made by politicians. So I'll talk today a little bit about public investment agencies, which often play a key role in filtering the actual scope for public decision making. So they determine which projects are eligible to be included in the budget, and therefore politicians can actually pass and build in law. Now, inhibitory institutions also can simply obstruct public decision making. So sometimes regulatory agencies take very long periods of time to review public decisions or to review investment projects. Simply by dragging their feet, bureaucrats might be able to change the types of decisions that politicians can make and the types of public investments that occur. Now, as some of those examples highlight, we can then think there are different types of inhibitory institutions. So these really are a quite diverse set of actors. And I divide the kind of powers into three different main types. So the first is that some inhibitory institutions simply are trying to review the internal consistency of government decisions. So sometimes this is the legality or the sort of fiscal backing for government investments. And to continue with that example, for example, comptrollers largely are there to make sure that public procurement decisions follow the requirements. So competitive bids, there's a contract, the companies that are being awarded the contract actually are registered and authorized to receive the contract. So they're essentially checking the internal consistency of government actions. So for example, here's someone at the contracting department from the comptroller's office in Ecuador who says, we aren't an obstacle. We're the check that what the law says actually applies to public investments. That's a pretty narrow vision of what an inhibitory institution is doing. A second broader conception comes from inhibitory institutions that really are focused on coordinating the actions of the state. And this often occurred through planning departments in Latin America, where the real goal was to make sure that governments were doing what they said they were going to do at the beginning of their term or were embodied in longer term plans. So for instance, the Secretary of Planning in Colombia says, one of the problems in many developed and developing countries is that specific economic policy decisions may be inconsistent with each other. We guarantee coherent management of the economy, hence eliminating waste. So planning departments often ensured that government investments corresponded to some underlying plan and that they also were articulated with each other. So if you were going to build a road in one part of the country, you'd also want to make sure that that road connected to the school investments that the government was making. And so that would be the type of review that a planning department might perform. Now, third, the most ambitious task for inhibitory institutions is what I would call optimization. And this has really grown since the 1980s to be the dominant role for inhibitory institutions when it comes to infrastructure investment. And here the aim really is to improve some sense of quality of public investment. So ensuring that the actual projects that the government wants to pursue do the most to improve social welfare. So for instance, the head of the Public Investment Agency in Peru called the SNIP says the central problem in developing countries is that politicians invest in whatever they feel like. Planning means looking at which projects will provide the highest social return and then doing them in a way that minimizes the cost to the state. Now, I just want to dive into this idea of optimization a little bit more because I think it's actually a pretty radical change in how governments think about the investment process. So in Latin America, this really began with Chile, which in 1975 shifted from a system of sort of macroeconomic coordination planning to project appraisal. And some scholars have called this process of project appraisal in a public investment system Chile's main non-traditional export. So Chile basically trains bureaucrats all across Latin America in the analysis of public investment and infrastructure projects in particular. And this becomes part of the public investment system approach that is used pretty much in most Latin American countries. Now, this sort of analysis often appears very technical. So it really is about the spread of cost-benefit analysis in a certain sense, but they're really important political debates that are embedded in these sorts of analyses. So, for example, Chileans were largely trained by the Chicago economist Arnold Harberger. And one of the big debates is how you actually assign distributional weights across the country. So for example, should projects that serve disconnected, rural, poor parts of the country have a heavier weight in public investment decisions. There's a lot of criticism, for example, that the UK follows this type of approach but doesn't use distributional weights, which means most infrastructure projects benefit London, which has the sort of highest returns on investment given its already well-known economic dominance. The second type of assumption is about how you calculate indirect benefits. So many investment projects have returns that extend well beyond their sort of direct utility. So if you think about a subway that improves air quality, how should we actually value that? Likewise, many public projects have complementarities with other projects. So if we return to the sort of coordination approach to planning, the sense was you can't just look at a single project because its impact is going to depend on what else the state is doing. So all of these things are going to change how governments think about the public interest and are a major part of the debate about what it means to optimize public investments. Now, I just want to emphasize that the role of politicians, once you have this sort of inhibitory control, often is to choose among vetted options. And the goal is to really eliminate white elephants from the choice set of politicians. But obviously, this is going to also generate political conflict, given that politicians are being told that there are only certain types of public decisions that they can take. And so just briefly, how do we think about the effects of these inhibitory institutions? Well, pretty intuitively, my main hypotheses are that they should slow down and also reduce the rents associated with infrastructure projects. So that should reduce the overall quantity of investment, in part because politicians probably need some rents to actually be encouraged to build these projects, and also because they certainly might just be frustrated by the bureaucratic hassles involved. On the other hand, we can think about these institutions improving the quality of investment. So they often are there to ensure that legal and technical standards are met, that contracting procedures are competitive, and also to make sure that some white elephant projects like the highway I discussed don't take place. So we might think that they're critical for quality. But of course, a lot of their effects are going to depend on whether politicians actually follow these rules. And there are two main challenges. The first is really that politicians will simply disregard the rules. So I call this a problem of institutional bypass. And this is really going to have a major effect on the quantity side. So politicians who want to ram their projects through probably will just jump over the rules whenever possible. And so that might attenuate any effects on the sort of quantity of investment. And then in terms of quality, one of the more subtle issues I'll talk about is this issue of expertise capture. So many inhibitory institutions really depend on inputs from other parts of the state and also many times from other consultants involved in providing the technical analyses for these types of projects. So one way that politicians can sort of short circuit the system is by actually hiring and controlling the inputs and experts who are involved in the process. And so inhibitory institutions, I suggest, really work best in cases where politicians can't change the rules. And this often means that we need to look at the subnational level, where politicians are often more constrained by national rules, and also contexts where politicians are blocked by strong courts or, in some cases, opposition actors. So let me turn to a couple of cases to just give you a better flavor for what these institutions are doing and some of the questions that arise around their operation. And again, this is meant to be sort of preliminary and thought-provoking. So I'm going to start with the case of Colombia, which in a lot of ways should be the sort of most likely case to see inhibitory institutions at work. Colombia is one of the first countries in Latin America to institute a comptroller, a Contraloría, in the 1920s. That becomes a really prominent institution within the Colombian state. Again, it had powers of prior control, looking at every single public contract. And then also in the 1950s, it really shifts to a slightly different model where the planning department gains real prominence within the government. And you can see this just in the physical structure. This is the the tower of the National Planning Department in the center of Bogota. It's an enormous institution that in part really played a key role in reviewing major public investment decisions. And today I want to talk about how it acted in the case of the metro project in Bogota. Bogota is Colombia's capital city of about 8 million people. It still has not built a metro, just to preview the end of the story. The average resident spends about 2 hours per day commuting, so there's a real demand for transportation. And the city has really debated building a metro since 1958, shortly after fires destroyed its trolley system. And the design plans for the project have changed and evolved, but in many ways have remained pretty consistent over time. So here you'll see two possibilities for what the metro route might look like, snaking around the city. And I just want to go through some of this long story because I think it really helps us see the different ways in which inhibitory institutions can act and also fail. So in 1979, Bogota commissions perhaps the first really serious study for a metro project. And at this point, the National Planning Department is really just gaining prominence in the investment process and questions this project basically on the grounds of territorial equity. So the real question is, why should the national government pay for a metro that is primarily going to serve the middle class in the country's richest city? And so the argument really is that these resources would be better spent on rural development, on basic services for the poor. Most metro projects do go through kind of dense urban centers, which will primarily serve the middle class, although also connecting obviously poorer neighborhoods. So planning rejects this project. 1981, Medellin, Colombia's second largest city, does a study for a metro. The same criticism comes up that the planning department says, why should the national government consider providing funding for this? And the difference in the Medellin case at that moment is that the president is actually from Medellin. And so he overrides the planning department and says that, well, the metro to Medellin will be a gift from his heart. Now, there are many warnings that this project has major contracting issues. The planning department intervenes multiple times to sort of warn of corruption and issues around the sort of debt in the project. But these are all ignored at a time that the president really has the power to override planning. So this is institutional bypass. Now, Bogota is still stuck without a metro. 1999, this debate comes up yet again to do new studies for a metro project. And in this case, planning again commissions an evaluation of the project. The budget for this project is extremely high. It's about 10% of the overall kind of investment of what the country is going to spend on infrastructure. And it's found that the project has social returns, but it was seen as financially responsible right after the Asian financial crisis hits. And so the president shelves the project on the recommendation of the planning department. The project returns yet again. So Bogota, in the interim, invests in sort of a bus system that improves public transportation, but still doesn't have the sort of high capacity metro project. And at this point, there are real questions about corruption in the contracting of the study. So this is an example where the mayor at the time has pretty tight links to the consulting firm that does the study for a new metro project in the city. The mayor, Samuel Moreno, eventually goes to jail for a different project, but it was revealed that he was part of this whole contracting ring. And planning, as well as the World Bank in this case, really question the studies and ask for more studies before they agree to sort of fund and contract this project. So yet again, the studies are shelved, probably for the better in this case. 2011, we have another round of studies for a metro project, this time done by a left-wing mayor, Gustavo Petro, who really sees the metro as part of building spatial equality in the city and connecting the city. The planning department, yet again, asks for more studies. The finance ministry drags its feet, doing a second financial review. And in this case, it really is kind of limited obstruction that this just takes so much time that the mayor, Petro, leaves office. He only has a single term before the project can be contracted. And I'll just flag in this case, there was a real political debate about whether the national government wanted to undermine a sort of left-wing mayor. Planning insists that it was following the same technical criteria that it has since 1979, but this is a more questionable case of whether this is to tie the hands of a political enemy. And finally, in 2018, Bogota gets its metro. In this case, it's an above ground metro, which is much cheaper, and many debates about whether this actually is the best project that serves the city. But I would say at this point, planning with the reduced budget finally pushes this project through, and also a center-right mayor who's aligned with the national government makes this an easier investment. We can sort of ask two main questions about this case in terms of the effects of this inhibitory institution, in this case, largely in the planning department. So first, it seems pretty clear that inhibitory actors delayed expenditures on the metro. And what I'm showing you here in this plot is just a kind of simple graph of what we usually think determines sort of investments in metro projects, which is really city size and country wealth. Bogota is a much larger city, and Colombia is wealthier than many countries that have invested in metro projects. And yet it took more than 50 years to build this project. And then the second question is really about project quality. So do we think inhibitory actors improve the quality of the metro project? And we can think about this both in terms of the selection of the project. So was the metro the right thing to build? Is above ground better than underground? And here, one of the hard things is that what inhibitory actors would say they're doing is thinking about the opportunity costs of the project. Metros are incredibly expensive. And so if you look at public opinion polls in Bogota and polling around the project, 90% of citizens of Bogota want the metro, but that doesn't answer the question of whether the country as a whole should prioritize the metro. And then another way to think about project quality is in terms of corruption in the project. And here, probably inhibitory actors really did stop substantial corruption in the 2011 project. But it's unclear whether that was worth the delay and whether in general their actions were intended to really improve the quality of the project in some way that there would be political agreement about the improvements in project quality. So that's an example of the sort of tensions created around inhibitory institutions when they do bind politicians. Now, I just want to give one other example of the actions of inhibitory institutions. This case from Peru is really one where presidents have had substantial decree power to circumvent what have been strong inhibitory institutions. So this example comes from the Interoceanic Highway in Peru, which is one of the largest and most important highway projects in the country. It's part of a regional integration initiative. So the highway extended from Brazil to southern Peru. It was 1,600 miles of highway, initially meant to cost $890 million. It ends up costing almost $2 billion, so huge overpriced project. And this is the first large project that passes through Peru's key inhibitory institution, which is called the SNIP. It's a public investment system modeled on the Chilean one. And this was really created in the aftermath of a giant corruption scandal involving President Alberto Fujimori, where the government is looking for something that will help it look good in the eyes of international investors. And the IDB had really pushed the idea of a SNIP system. This is also the first large-scale public-private partnership in Peru, which I won't get into today, but does change some of the financial calculations on the project. Now, SNIP, the public investment system and the key inhibitory actor, really acts to try to optimize investments. Its mandate is to consider the social priorities of the country. So the Ministry of Transportation had contracted a study that showed enormous benefits from this highway project, an estimated $500 million in benefits, whereas the SNIP did its own study that projected pretty large losses. And it really questions the quality of the studies that were part of this project. And it says, look, this highway was not a priority. It was never part of the Ministry of Transportation's planning. There's very little traffic. It's not going to work as a PPP project. And even as a public investment, there probably aren't the returns to justify it. There were really inflated benefits in the initial study. So the calculations were that the south of Peru, which is one of the poorest parts of the country, would increase its agricultural production from almost nothing to being a quarter of all agricultural exports in Peru. There were also some pretty exaggerated profit margins. So the idea was that the crops being grown in the south of Peru were going to have average profitability of 90%. Most crops in Peru had an average profitability of something more like 15%. And so SNEP officials first recommended just shelve this project. It's not useful, it's not wanted. And then they said, if it's going to be built, it should be built in a way that minimizes the costs. So that would be paving the road on the cheap, then seeing whether there really was demand for this highway, or what's known as stage construction. Instead, the president at the time, Toledo, decides to issue a supreme decree to exempt the project from the SNEP's review. And he says this is to avoid delays. He just wants to build the project, and these silly bureaucrats are holding him back. He really cites the support of Southern Peru, or the mayors and governors of Southern Peru, in actually wanting this project. We now know that this was the subject of immense bribes. So Toledo received about $20 million in bribes from Odebrecht, which probably was part of his rush to contract such an enormous project without institutional reviews. Now, the second piece of this, beyond bypassing the institution, is that Toledo also understood that a huge part of the analysis of the project came from studies from external consultants. So what I'm showing you in this graph is just the growth of consulting as part of the Peruvian state, and more specifically in the infrastructure sector, after the implementation of this public investment system. So many of the technical analyses depend on outside expertise. At the same time, actual bureaucratic capacity within the ministry plummets. So basically, the public sector goes from having something like 40,000 employees in the 1980s to having just 10,000. And many of them are lawyers in charge of contracting, as opposed to engineers with the technical expertise to review and even build projects. So why did the studies have such unrealistic assumptions? What was the debate that was happening within the state? Well, a huge part of it is that the early studies, or what are known as pre-feasibility studies, were done by a friend of Toledo's and a sort of fly-by-night consultancy that made them look like the project was hugely beneficial for Peru. The second set of studies was done by a consulting firm, Alpha Consult, which we now know also was part of Odebrecht's giant corruption ring. And so many of the unreasonable benefits and analyses came from this clear link in the consulting firm with the government. I should also note that Peñaranda, who owned the consulting firm, also directed the Chamber of Commerce that was doing a lot of advocacy during this period for the trade benefits coming from the project. So again, we have the capture of a lot of civil society that was supposed to be also providing independent analysis of the benefits. And so when some figures in the government, both from the SNEP and then even the sort of vice minister within the Ministry of Transport, started to question the project and the underlying studies, this became a really technical debate about the quality of studies and the way that these calculations were done, that the public and the media and even opposition politicians really couldn't enter. So for example, when the vice minister started to question the studies, here's what the director of the main public-private investment agency in Peru said, which is, what was the support of Guerra Garcia? 10 PowerPoint slides. What was on the other side? An engineering study with decades of experience and the Minister of Transportation approving it. So this became a fight between consultants in the eyes of the public, when at the same time we had, sorry, this just jumped ahead. That's very weird. Sorry, guys. Hopefully you guys can still see the slides okay. Okay, so this became a fight between consultants, and it meant that the actual ability of civil society and other inhibitory actors to kind of question what was happening was reduced. So let me just finish with some takeaways from this case and from the idea of inhibitory institutions more generally. So, sorry, my slides are totally, I don't know what happened. Hopefully you guys are just seeing the slides. Let me quickly just try restarting them and see if that helps. Sorry about that. So strange. Okay, well, we'll just try to make it through the end. So just some last reflections. So what I tried to do today was really emphasize the importance of this part of the bureaucracy that I think we've studied less, which are these institutional rules to allow bureaucrats to review and obstruct public good decisions prior to their implementation. And I think that this often is critical for high quality public goods provision. Second, I've tried to suggest that the other side of this is many times inhibitory institutions end up reducing the quantity of investment, either because they reduce the rents involved in these projects, or they just simply are a bureaucratic hurdle that politicians don't want to have to deal with. Just to preview, this inspires a sort of title for my second book project, Creative Construction, which is a play on Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction, where the idea was that you need to have some monopoly rents to encourage innovation in a society. Likewise, you might actually need some of these monopoly rents to encourage investment in public goods and infrastructure more specifically, but that obviously comes at the expense of the quality of those investments. Third, these institutions can be weak for pretty well-known reasons. So especially as a Latin Americanist, this is a common dynamic of executives simply bypassing institutional rules. But I think there's also a less studied set of reasons why these institutions often fail, which comes from the way that state reforms occurred and gave greater prominence to consultants that politicians became very astute at actually capturing, and that made it harder for many societal actors to actually question the decisions being made. Now, I do want to argue that these inhibitory institutions, although weak and challenged by politicians, still are relevant. And I think that they are for a couple of reasons. So one is that they've received a lot of international support from actors like the IDB, the World Bank, and these are quite technocratic pockets within the state. I think that they have the capacity to actually act and prevent a lot of wrongdoing in the infrastructure sector. On the other, and I think they're also important because they reflect changing ideas about how to think about the public interest, how to decide which public goods to build, and they also change how civil society is expected to criticize and contest the types of projects that governments are building. Finally, these institutions often play a key role at the subnational level, which I've talked less about today. But just to preview some of the broader book, if we think about the way they constrain subnational politicians, it's often much more powerful. So this last figure is just showing you the number of times that mayors visit Lima, and more specifically visit the agencies that are required to approve their projects as inhibitory actors. And you'll see that on average, mayors are visiting something like 10,000 times a year, which is an incredible centralization of bureaucratic power around this idea that the quality of investment needs to be pre-screened and checked by inhibitory actors. So just in terms of the next steps, there's obviously this question of whether inhibitory institutions actually have a causal effect on the quantity or quality of public goods provision. One of the things that I'm doing is using some of the discontinuities in the subnational rollout of these institutional rules to estimate their effects on both infrastructure quantity and quality. I know, though, that this type of research design has a theoretical cost. So presidents often can ignore these institutions, while subnational politicians cannot. So we can't scale up the sort of results from the subnational level and think that inhibitory institutions are going to do the same thing at the national level. And I think one of the huge lessons from the Odebrecht scandal and corruption scandals worldwide is oftentimes institutions and inhibitory actors that are meant to be looking out for corruption problems, they are doing their job, but they're focused on quite small projects on the subnational level. And that allows what I would consider the white elephants to pass through. And the key question in all of this is how governments and bureaucrats actually can constrain presidents, especially when infrastructure projects have corrupt motives behind them. So thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions, and apologies that my slides kind of got confused there at the end.
Hi, Alisha. Thank you. This was really illuminating. And I guess I know we only have 12 minutes left, so I will ask you two relatively short questions, and then if you want to wait to answer, and we can see if there are more questions, you can answer them all at once, so you can have maximal choice. Okay, so for my first thought about the bigger picture question of these inhibitory institutions is that it reminds me a lot of James Scott's work on legibility. And so I wonder here if you think, to me, it seems like rather than looking at how citizens are legible to states, here you're asking about how state expenditures are legible, first to these intermediary institutions, the inhibitory institutions, and secondly to citizens as a whole, I would think. And so to me, it seems like there are three kind of big observable implications that that you've started to talk about in part, but it, to me, seem like they you could think about them in a sense of connecting it to the literature we already know. And the first is like, if you think about how, one alternative way to think about how these institutions work is how legible they really are to the people, how legible they make this cost-benefit analysis as opposed to illegible for the people who should be able to assess it. And one kind of figure that you brought up in the case of Peru that I think you could apply more broadly is the percentage of the state budget expenditures that are spent on private technical expertise, such as private consulting agencies. I would love to see that as kind of like, helping us think across countries where does it seem that they're kind of failing systematically versus succeeding. Secondly, what's the competitive nature of civil society and this kind of like accountability sector? And the more competitive it is, the more we would think that these institutions can help kind of leverage this cost-benefit analysis to make state expenditures more legible and kind of ensure that the white elephants don't make it through. And third, that the transparency of state bureaucratic outputs, it also is going to matter for whether, at the end of the day, political competition can kind of force systems to improve versus not. So I would love to see kind of how you think about that. My second, more specific question is you've talked about how these constraints generally bind more at the subnational versus the national level, and I wonder if there aren't some other scope conditions that you could leverage for causal inference. And so here I was thinking about first and foremost budget constraints. So you've talked about how opportunity cost is often considered in deciding whether to let a given project kind of through gatekeeping or not. And I could imagine that national governments could strategically minimize the number of projects that get through, whether it's because a left-wing mayor is in charge or something else, by simply lowering the percentage of national expenditures that are kind of eligible for development projects more generally. And so one thing that would be good to see would be not just the kind of log GDP by the log population, as you looked at initially for the first case in Bogota, but looking at potentially the log GDP compared to the political coalitions in place at any given moment. So kind of, you could imagine more left-oriented progressive coalitions are probably going to have fewer constraints than more right-based or tilted coalitions. Secondly, the share of the national budgets allocated to development versus things like security, for example. Yeah, and I guess finally, just thinking through what the government is doing in other domains. So are they working to kind of limit versus expand discretion, and the extent to which the state actually, the national state has more discretion, you would expect kind of more white elephants, to the extent that you have broader political systems that are limiting discretion, the better you would expect these institutions to work at the national, not just the subnational level. So I won't expect you to respond. I want to. I see we have at least one more question. So maybe I'll raise that with you, and then you should have at least 5 minutes to respond. And this is from Gonzalo Tamayo, who asks, "Is it possible that the development of Transmiliano as an alternative mass transportation system actually helped the Planification Nacional to delay metro approval?" So a case-specific question here. So the floor is yours. If there are other questions, oh, I see. Sorry, there's actually another question answer. So let me try to summarize the other questions. So from Sam Bazi, who's also an affiliate with the Human Capital Initiative here, do we know much about the types of political regimes that are most conducive to building these inhibitory institutions? So I think that's in line with one of the questions I asked. And in democratic settings, it seems like one explanation for inhibitory practices could be political cycles and bureaucratic turnover in relevant ministries. So to the extent that you see variation there, or you can exploit changes in rules, that would be really promising. And finally, a question from Matt Taylor at American University. Conceptually, I'd like to hear a bit more about why you choose this term, inhibitory institutions, and what distinguishes it from other kinds of families of accountability institutions. So maybe I'll leave it there, and please answer as you wish. Thank you, Dr. Holland.
Thank you. These are all such wonderful questions. Maybe I'll go in reverse order. So I do move away from the term accountability institution, in part because, as I talked about, I see them as acting at a different point in time. So intervening prior to any formal malfeasance or any public decision even being made. So I do think accountability means, to me, responsiveness, or being responsible for some actual action. And so what's unique about these institutions is the timing at which they can intervene in the public process. But I think the second part of your question, Matt, is really important, which is that these are not just anti-corruption authorities. So one of the things I'm trying to do in this project is have us think that many of the problems in the infrastructure sector aren't just about what we traditionally think of as kind of corruption in the actual execution of the project, but they more fundamentally come also in the choice of project and the actual selection. I think there are many problems of capture that we don't study enough, and where these inhibitory institutions become important because they're not just looking for sort of technically, are the rules being followed? Has a politician actually, accepted a bribe? But instead are trying to think about the actual broader kind of public interest and sort of optimizing policy for the public interest. And I do think that this idea is really connected to how state reforms occur and very much tied to Thatcher and the sort of neoliberal turn more broadly, in the sense that these bureaucrats are thought to really be doing cost-benefit analysis for the entire state. And then the question becomes, where is the role for politics? Why do politicians accept these institutions? And what assumptions are embedded in having bureaucrats do this analysis? So I do think that these institutions become something much broader than a simply anti-corruption agency, or even a sort of legal accountability agency. They're about a conception of the public interest. So many questions. Maybe from that, it's just worth looping back to some of Rachel's questions a minute, which is, I didn't speak much about how civil society was linked to this entire process, and that is kind of another piece of the project. And I think one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is that the rise of these institutions in part is a shift away from an older planning model, where part of the idea of planning was also to have a kind of longer term view of the projects that were in the pipeline. And that really changed how civil society could organize, in the sense that if, a project in your region continuously wasn't being built, you could mobilize and say, why aren't we building the metro in Bogota? Why aren't we building a highway in southern Peru? And that was all sort of part of the portfolio and the national plan. One of the things that happens in the sort of turn to just analyze specific projects for their optimal characteristics is that there's no sense of what the longer term or broader goals of the government are. And it also changes the political process, because what usually happens is you have the mobilization of some groups that are going to benefit from the project, but there's no actual alternative to mobilize the rest of society for what's being lost, what's not being built, what projects are being deprioritized in the process. And that job then falls to bureaucrats to sort of analyze an abstract public interest. And so that's one way that civil society gets sort of cut out of this, and simply is the demand for the project in a cost-benefit analysis, rather than an organized kind of voice and pushing for what priority should be. So there's this kind of broader shift that's part of the process. Let me just turn to these questions about sort of where these institutions come from and how they vary. Because again, I didn't really talk as much about this, but I do think, there's a sort of cycle of when they are applied, in the sense that many times they do follow corruption scandals and economic crises. And so they tend to be introduced during times of austerity, when politicians often want to avoid blame for sort of stopping spending and restraining spending. And that what usually happens is that as revenues increase and there's more money available to spend on infrastructure, politicians no longer want to be constrained by technocrats, and they attack these institutions. So there's a kind of common life and death cycle of these institutions that makes them hard to study at the national level, because obviously that's endogenous to a lot of other factors as well. There's a second story, though, which often comes from politicians trying to tie the hands of their opponents. So many times these institutions start because presidents want legislatures to actually spend less money, and this is a way to stop pork spending. Or they want subnational mayors to spend less money, and then they get applied to presidents, and you see similar dynamics of attack. I know we're at time, but let me just say one last thing about the Transmilenio, which is that it might have reduced some of the pressure and created a real alternative. Part of what these institutions do is consider alternative ways to achieve the same end. So as BRT, so Transmilenio is a sort of rapid bus transport project. As that gains prominence as a model across the world, planners do think about, why are we building an expensive underground metro? Shouldn't we be doing this alternative? Why aren't politicians talking about this alternative? So that is important as part of the technical analysis. But I think the long history of this project shows that this isn't just about a debate about the technical solution, but also about territorial equality and corruption. And there are kind of many different factors that at different points in time lead the planning institution to play this inhibitory role. So those are quick answers to really wonderful questions. Thank you all for joining and for raising these issues.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Holland, for a really inspiring look into your new book and the ways in which technical constraints can actually improve equality and not just reduce it. So we're really lucky to have been here today. Please do join us again on the 2nd of December for the next speaker series. And please do subscribe to the HCI newsletter for updates if you have not already. And I hope we can all reconvene face-to-face in good health and good spirits some point in the coming year. Thank you so much, Professor Holland, and thank you everyone.